Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this episode contains the names of deceased persons. Viewer and listener discretion is advised. Vanished West acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands discussed throughout this episode and pays respect to elders past and present. The information presented in this episode comes from publicly available records, coronial findings and media reporting and is shared respectfully. In July of 2018, a woman walked into a Western Australian police station hoping to find her mother. She wasn't there to report a recent disappearance. She wasn't responding to a media appeal or following up on a police investigation. As far as she knew, her mother had been living somewhere in the state for years. She just wanted to find her. For most of her life, she'd believed the story she'd grown up with. Veronica had left when she was little. She'd gone back to Port Hedland and built a new life. It wasn't the ending any child hopes for, but it was the only explanation she'd ever been given. The conversation that followed changed everything. As police began making inquiries, they contacted Veronica's family in the Pilbara. They expected those conversations to answer a few questions and perhaps help reunite a daughter with the mother she'd barely known. Instead, they uncovered something no one had expected. Veronica's family believed she'd spent the past 2 decades living with her daughter, whereas her daughter believed Veronica had spent those same years living with her family in the Pilbara. Neither was true. For the first time, people began asking a question no one had thought to ask before. Where was Veronica Lockyer? And where was the baby who disappeared with her? This is Vanished West, a podcast exploring the stories of people who disappeared across Western Australia. Each episode examines the lives they left behind, the investigations that followed, and the questions that remain unanswered. Vanished West is independently researched and produced by me. If you'd like to help keep the podcast going, you can support the show through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the episode description. Before Veronica Lockyer became the centre of a missing persons investigation, she was just an ordinary woman getting on with the challenging life. She was born in Port Hedland on the 28th of October 1965 and was a proud Kariyarra woman. The Pilbara wasn't just where she lived, it was where her family, culture and identity were deeply rooted. Kariyarra country stretches across the coastline and inland around Port Hedland, extending west towards the Sherlock River and south towards the Yule River. It is a landscape shaped by ancient stories, family connections, and enduring cultural traditions. Veronica spent time in and around 12 Mile, Warralong, and Strelly, communities where family ties stretched across generations and where moving between towns to stay with relatives or support one another was simply part of life. People remembered Veronica as someone who was a proud woman of her culture and wanted to share it with others. She spent time teaching the Kariyarra language to younger generations, helping preserve knowledge that had been passed down long before her. She was also a mother. By 1998, Veronica had 6 children. Like many families, hers had changed over the years. Some of her older children were being cared for by extended family, but that didn't diminish the bond that they shared. During the inquest, her children spoke about a mother they loved and one they believed loved them deeply. On the 22nd of April 1998, Veronica gave birth to her youngest child, Adell Shirley Partridge. Adell was only 7 months old when she disappeared. It's an age filled with small milestones that families often remember for the rest of their lives. Babies are beginning to recognise familiar faces, explore the world around them, and reveal little glimpses of the people they're becoming. Parents talk about first birthdays, first words, and first steps. They make plans without ever imagining that those plans might never come. There is very little recorded about Adell's short life beyond official documents and the memories of those who knew her as a baby. Perhaps that's one of the quiet tragedies of this case. She never had the opportunity to tell her own story. Everything we know about her comes from people who loved her. As 1998 unfolded, Veronica wasn't living the life of someone preparing to disappear. She was raising her daughters, making plans, trying to build a future. What that future looked like, however, was becoming increasingly complicated. The next chapter of Veronica's life would be shaped by a relationship that years later the coroner would describe as being marked by family and domestic violence. By the time Adell was born, Veronica's life had become increasingly unsettled. She had been in a relationship with Craig Partridge for several years. Together they had 2 daughters, Donna, born in 1996, and Adell in 1998. On the surface, they were a young family trying to build a life together, moving between communities in the Pilbara before later spending time in Merredin and Perth. What wasn't visible to most people was what family members would later describe happening behind closed doors. During the coronial inquest, Veronica's sons, Ian and Adrian, both recalled witnessing violence towards their mother. Adrian described seeing Veronica with 2 black eyes and remembers arguments that left a lasting impression on him, even as a child. He also spoke about violence towards the children and the fear that existed within that home. Those memories remained with him decades later. Craig also gave evidence at the inquest. He acknowledged that there had been occasions where he had been physically violent towards Veronica, although his account differed from that of other witnesses in several important respects. After considering all of the evidence, the coroner accepted that the relationship had been characterised by family and domestic violence. Reading the evidence now, it's tempting to view Veronica's life through the lens of what would happen later. But in 1998, she wasn't looking backwards. She was trying to work out what came next. That part of the story is significant because family and domestic violence rarely follows a straight path. People don't simply leave one day and never return. Research has shown that many victim survivors leave and return multiple times before they are able to separate permanently. Fear, financial dependence, housing, concern for children, isolation, and hope that things might change can all influence those decisions. Those challenges can be even greater for Aboriginal women, particularly those living in regional and remote Western Australia. Distance from support services, housing shortages, cultural obligations, and the ongoing impacts of historical disadvantage can make leaving safely more difficult. Those barriers continue to have real consequences even today. National figures from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare show that First Nations women are around 24 more times likely than non-Indigenous women to be hospitalised because of assault. In remote and very remote parts of Australia, that figure rises to almost 48 times more likely. Statistics like these don't explain what happened to Veronica at all, but they do remind us that her experience wasn't unfolding in isolation. The records show a woman who was trying to protect her children, to find stability, trying to make decisions that would give her family a better future. Over the course of 1998, those efforts became increasingly visible. She sought help through the family court. She spent time in women's refuges. She's reached out to police numerous times. Each step suggests someone searching for a way forward, even if that path wasn't always clear. It would become one of the most important periods in understanding what happened to Veronica and Adell, because within months, their lives would simply disappear from the records. By early 1998, Veronica wasn't simply hoping life would improve. She was actively taking steps to change it. In April, while heavily pregnant with Adell, she turned to the Family Court of Western Australia. In an affidavit filed with the court, Veronica described a relationship she said had become increasingly violent and controlling. She alleged Craig had threatened her, assaulted her on numerous occasions, and made her fear for her own safety and the safety of her children. Among the allegations were claims that he had knocked out 3 of her front teeth during one assault, and while she was pregnant, headbutted her and attempted to break her neck. She also alleged he had threatened to sell their young daughter during an argument. An affidavit contains one person's account of events, and those allegations were never tested in a criminal court. They do, however, provide an important insight into what Veronica herself was saying she was experiencing at that time. Just days later, on the 22nd of April 1998, Veronica gave birth to Adell at King Edward Memorial Hospital. Within weeks, she successfully obtained family court orders granting her custody of Donna. It seemed as though the future she'd been working towards might finally be within reach. Life, though, is rarely that straightforward. The records show that sometime after the court proceedings, Veronica and Craig reconciled. They moved to Meriden, where Craig obtained a Department of Housing property and the family attempted to start again. It's one of the hardest parts of this case to understand. From the outside, returning to a relationship after seeking protection through the courts can seem impossible to explain. But family and domestic violence specialists have been challenging that assumption for years. Leaving an abusive relationship is often described as a process rather than a single event. Many victim survivors leave several times before they are able to separate permanently. Others return because they have children together, nowhere else to live, hope that things will improve, or because leaving safely simply is impossible at that moment. In August 1998, Veronica attended Meriden Police Station, seeking assistance to leave Craig. Police recorded that she intended to contact them when she needed help. When they didn't hear from her, officers carried out a welfare check. According to the available records, they found no immediate concerns, although there are no detailed notes describing what was seen or discussed during that visit. A few days later, mental health workers also attended the family home. Their records described the situation as appearing normal. Reading that today is unsettling, not because anyone should have known what would happen, but because it reminds us of how difficult it can be to understand what is happening inside a relationship from a single conversation or a single visit. By the second half of 1998, Veronica was still caring for her daughters, she was still making plans, and from everything the record tells us, she was still trying to build a life beyond the difficulties she'd been facing. Within a matter of weeks, the paper trail that would follow Veronica through courts, hospitals, police stations, and government offices would begin to fall silent. One of the most challenging parts of any missing person investigation is working out when ordinary life quietly became something else. There's rarely a single moment where everything changes. Instead, investigators are left piecing together everyday events that only became significant years later. For Veronica, those final weeks are reconstructed through official records rather than personal memories. On the 25th of October 1998, Veronica attended the Centrelink office in South Headland. During that visit, she had updated her address to 12 Mile Community. There was nothing unusual about the appointment, it was simply just another interaction with the government agency she'd used throughout her adult life. At the time, no one could have known it would become the last independently confirmed sighting of Veronica Lockyer. A week later, on the 1st of November, Craig took Donna and Adell to Headland Health Campus. Hospital records confirm Adell was present that day. Veronica was not. There is no evidence explaining why she wasn't there. Craig told the investigators later on he believed Veronica remained nearby and continued caring for Adell during that period. Beyond that, the records are silent. The final documented trace of Adell comes a few weeks later. On the 24th of November 1998, health records show she received an immunisation at Meriden Community Health Centre. Investigators were unable to identify who brought her to the appointment because the record had been created electronically and no longer contained those details. Even so, police found no reason to doubt that the immunisation had taken place, and the coroner accepted it as the last confirmed record relating to Adell. After that, the records stop. There are no further Centrelink appointments, no Medicare activity, no contact with the Department of Housing, no banking transactions that placed Veronica anywhere, no employment records, no evidence that either Veronica or Adell accessed the services that they had previously relied upon. When detectives later examined those missing pieces, it wasn't one record that concerned them. It was the complete absence of all of them. For someone raising a young baby, that silence was difficult to explain away. Investigators would eventually focus on one final account. It came from Craig. He said that after returning to Perth, the family stopped at Centrepoint Shopping Centre in Midland. According to his evidence, an argument broke out between him and Veronica. He told police Veronica took Adell and walked away, intending to catch a taxi while he left with Donna. He said that was the last time he ever saw Veronica and the last time he ever saw baby Adell. Over the years, Craig's account remained broadly the same, although some details had changed. The coroner examined those inconsistencies during the inquest, but ultimately found there wasn't enough evidence to determine whether any part of his account was untrue. Nor was there sufficient evidence to make any adverse finding against him. If Veronica and Adell disappeared in late 1998, the question becomes obvious. Why did it take until 2018 for anyone to report them missing? Well, the answer isn't simple. For years, the people who love Veronica were living with different versions of the same story. Her family in the Pilbara believed she had chosen to remain with her partner and her youngest daughter. Painful as that was, they believed it was a decision Veronica had made, and they tried to respect what they thought was her wish to live privately. At the same time, Donna was growing up believing her mother had returned to the Pilbara and started a new life. Years later, one of Veronica's relatives publicly addressed the criticism that followed the missing persons appeal. She explained that the family had never stopped looking for Veronica, but they had been searching based on the belief that she had chosen a different path. She asked people not to speculate about what had happened, saying simply, "Our girl comes from a big family that loves her dearly. All we are asking for is public help." That's a really important perspective to throw into the mix because it reminds us that families don't always have the same information. Sometimes they act on the only explanation that they have, even when that explanation later proves to be wrong. Western Australia is vast. Families are often separated by enormous distances, and it wasn't unusual for relatives to move between communities or lose contact for periods of time. Painful as the silence was, neither side had any reason to believe something far more serious had happened. Meanwhile, Donna was growing up with the belief that her mother had made a choice. She believed Veronica had left. As a child, she accepted the explanation because there was little else she could do. As she grew older, though, the questions never really disappeared. Who was her mother? What had really happened? Why had she never come back for her? Those questions became even more important after Donna became a mother herself. She wanted her own children to understand where they had come from. She wanted them to know the family she had never really known. So she started searching. She wasn't looking for a missing person at that time, she was just looking for her mother. When she eventually made contact with Veronica's family, everyone expected a reunion. Instead, they realised they had spent almost 20 years believing completely different stories. Donna thought Veronica had been living with them. They thought Veronica had been living with Donna. It was only then that anyone understood something was terribly wrong. On the 5th of July 2018, Donna attended the Kwinana police station and formally reported her mother missing. For Western Australia Police, the case was unlike most missing persons investigations. They weren't searching for someone who had disappeared days or weeks earlier. They were beginning an investigation into events that were already 2 decades old. The discovery also changed Donna's understanding of her own life. She learned she had siblings she had barely known. She began reconnecting with family and with her Kariyara heritage. During the inquest, she spoke about what those lost years had meant to her. She described growing up believing her mother had abandoned her, only to discover that was not true. She also spoke about something else she had felt had been taken from her: her connection to family, her culture, her language. And at one point, Donna told the court, "Craig stripped me from everything. Stripped me from my language, my culture." Those words weren't about the investigation. They were about identity. Because this case isn't only about a mother and a baby who disappeared. It's also about the years that were lost afterwards. Years in which a daughter grew up believing one story while another family believed something completely different. By the time the Western Australian Police began investigating Veronica and Adell's disappearance, the greatest obstacle at that point was not lack of effort. It was time. Detectives weren't starting with fresh witness statements or recent CCTV footage. They were trying to reconstruct lives that had quietly fallen out of sight. The investigation was eventually taken over by the Homicide Squad under Operation Tellurium. That didn't mean police knew a homicide had occurred. Rather, the complete absence of any evidence that Veronica or Adell had remained alive after 1998 meant the investigation required the specialist resources available to homicide detectives. Over the following years, investigators carried out an extensive review of Veronica's life. They identified around 120 witnesses, they completed almost 200 investigative actions, they searched government records, followed information from members of the public, travelled to Meriden with a mobile police facility, examined unidentified human remains, and consulted forensic specialists. Every avenue that might explain what had happened to Veronica and Adell was explored. One of the first things detectives looked for was proof that Veronica or Adell had been alive after the late 1998 timeframe. They searched for Medicare activity, Centrelink records, bank records, tax records, driver's license renewals, employment, interstate travel, anything that could place either of them somewhere after they were last seen. They found nothing. For Veronica, that absence was striking. Throughout her adult life, she had regularly accessed government services, then without explanation, every one of those interactions just stopped. Even a Commonwealth bank account containing almost $3,000 remained untouched for years before it was eventually closed because of inactivity. Investigators found no evidence that Veronica or Adell had established new lives elsewhere in Australia or overseas. As detectives continued their inquiries, they faced another challenge. Memories fade over time. Some witnesses had also died before police even knew there was a case to investigate. Others struggled to recall events that far back. Records that might once have answered important questions had been lawfully destroyed under government retention policies. In some instances, investigators could confirm an interaction had taken place, but the detailed notes explaining what happened no longer existed. Despite those challenges, the investigation gradually built a picture of what had happened, or perhaps what hadn't happened. There was no reliable evidence that Veronica had contacted her family, no evidence that she'd accessed any healthcare or government payments, no evidence that she'd opened any new bank accounts or established another identity. The same was true for Adell. For a mother and a baby to disappear so completely from every official record was extraordinarily unusual. In 2021, police referred the matter to the state coroner. The inquest heard from investigators, family members, health professionals, police officers, and Craig Partridge. It examined hundreds of pages of evidence tracing Veronica's life through court files, medical records, witness statements, and official documents. In her findings, Deputy State Coroner Sarah Linton concluded beyond reasonable doubt that both Veronica Lockyer and Adell Partridge had died. However, she was unable to determine when they died, where they died, or how they died. The evidence simply didn't allow those findings to be made. The coroner also found there was insufficient evidence to determine that any particular person had caused their deaths, including Craig Partridge, despite him being the last known person to report seeing Veronica and Adell alive. Today, Veronica and Adell remain missing. Their case is still open. And after years of investigation, one question remains exactly as it was when Donna first walked into Kwinana Police Station. What happened to Veronica? And what happened to baby Adell? When I finished researching Veronica and Adell's story, I found myself thinking less about the mystery and more about the life that came before it. Before the police investigations, the coronial inquest, before they became names on a missing persons register. Veronica was a proud Kariyara woman. She was a daughter, a sister, and a mother. She taught her language, remained connected to her country, and from everything we've heard throughout this episode, she was trying to build a better future for herself and her children. Adell was only 7 months old. She never celebrated her first birthday, never took her first steps, never had the chance to tell her own story. Everything we know about her comes through the memories of the people who loved her. And perhaps the hardest part of Veronica's story is that it doesn't feel like it belongs only in 1998. As I was reading through the evidence, there were moments that felt painfully familiar. A woman trying to leave an abusive relationship, children caught in the middle, family members doing everything they could with the information they had, police involvement, court proceedings, women's refuges. These aren't unique to Veronica's story. They are circumstances that continue to affect families across Western Australia today. We understand family and domestic violence far better than we did almost 30 years ago. We know that coercive control can be just as damaging as physical violence. We know that leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time. We know that children can carry the effects of violence long into adulthood. We also know that Aboriginal women continue to be disproportionately affected. National figures show First Nations women are around 24 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be hospitalised because of an assault. In remote and very remote parts of Australia, that figure rises to almost 48 times more likely. Those statistics don't explain what happened to Veronica. They don't tell us where she and Adell went, but they do remind us that Veronica's experience wasn't unfolding in isolation. And despite decades of greater awareness, the numbers continue to move in the wrong direction. Here in Western Australia, family violence incident reports increased from fewer than 48,000 in 2020 to 2021 to more than 63,000 in 2024 to 2025. During the same period, police, family and domestic violence call-outs rose from 63,000 to more than 84,000. Behind every one of those numbers is a person, a family, children, parents, grandparents, communities trying to make sense of lives changed by violence. A recent review by the Western Australian Ombudsman found that significant challenges remain, including inconsistencies in risk assessment, gaps in data collection, and ongoing difficulties ensuring vulnerable people receive the support that they need. No report can tell us what happened to Veronica and Adell, but it does remind us that protecting people experiencing family and domestic violence remains one of our greatest challenges. For Donna, this case was never simply about finding her mother and her sister. It was discovering that the story she'd believed since childhood wasn't true. For Veronica's family, it was learning that the daughter, sister and mother that they had thought chosen another life had in fact disappeared many years earlier. And for everyone who loved Veronica and Adell, it was the realization that almost 20 years had passed before they were all asking the same question. Where are they? Today, Veronica Lockyer and Adell Partridge remain missing. Their family are still waiting. Their case remains open. Sometimes we think of missing persons cases as stories about the past. Veronica and Adell's story reminds us that for families left behind, they are lived every single day. If you know something, no matter how small it might seem, please contact Western Australia Police or Crime Stoppers. After all these years, the smallest memory could still become the piece that helps a family finally understood what happened. If this episode resonated with you, I'd also really appreciate if you could follow the podcast and leave a review or rating on your favourite podcast platform. It helps more people discover these stories and keeps the memory of those who vanished alive. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and never forget those who vanished from the West.